So we are meant to jump into what I'm expecting to be a very interesting Q&A with Ricardo, Rachel, and Max. I do want to check if Rachel and Max are already online, if we can start, or I see Rachel. Hi, Rachel. Oh, yay. Okay. We've got a full house. Wonderful. So we will jump into the Q&A. I see some of you have been putting in questions into the Q&A tab. I encourage you to keep adding, and we will try to go through as many as we can. So kind of jumping into it, when I was preparing for this conference, I got unusually excited about this particular grouping of the three of you because, and your topic specifically, because I think that these lines of inquiry are among those topics that have kind of they've been bubbling a little bit, you know, in some of our work. It's been really interesting to see how people have been talking about this maybe some years prior, but it felt very underground, especially in the sense of connecting it to design. And I feel like now there's a bit of a resurgence for it. It's gaining more popularity, it's gaining more relevance, and there's been an urgency for people to begin learning and adopting and designing with these frameworks in mind. And I find that very, very interesting and curious. So kind of with that framework in mind, I would ask you, what do you think about the idea of authenticity? It's kind of to all of you with your topics. How can we approach these spaces with authenticity instead of potentially having these kind of topics, whether it's imposter syndrome, or it's trauma-informed design, or even questioning power and empathy and kind of how we approach our biases? How can we practice those authentically instead of them accidentally becoming just another thing to check off on the path to doing design? And I invite any of you to jump in.
I could just say something very short, very, very quick. I think just sharing my own experience. I read Paulo Freire in uni in 1991, 92, and it didn't make a lot of sense. I mean, I knew there was something interesting there, but obviously at the time I couldn't see the connections with design, and it's only about 20 years later that it clicked for me. And this is after work with community and everything else. And then I understood, and honestly, my respect for my professors and instructors at uni was 10 times higher. I thought, okay, these people had an intention there. But just my own personal experience has been as a designer to reread these texts. And I get very, very excited when I see people writing about them, Hannah Arendt, Paulo Freire, other people. But often, very few times, I think designers engage with these topics. And I think when they do, or when we do, there are wonderful ideas to be elaborated from their classic work, from their classic ideas. But it's something I think that remains to be done to build that authenticity that you talk about. I agree with you, Marina. I think it's a work to be done, and I think comes from, in my experience, it's come from practice and from forums like this, and designers engaging with the ideas, because then we go like, oh, what does natality mean in our practice? You know, like what are the implications for us, as opposed to just like an abstract concept or even an applied concept in a different field. I think designers have biases towards creation and experimentation and exploration that other fields just perhaps don't see as natural.
I'll jump in. I appreciate that you use that word authenticity, because it's one of the words that I use when I talk about core values, and especially when I've had conversations or guest lectures when I'm talking with students in particular. So they might be social work students, they might be design students, but in typically some type of a higher ed setting. I start off by saying that, you know, like a lot of my work is grounded in these core values that I didn't know 20, 25 years ago. I had to develop them and identify them over time, but one of them being authenticity. And I think one of the best things that we can do is to identify what some of those core values are. Like, why is it that we do this work? What brings us to want to do this work? And you know, those values they'll change over time, or they might stay firmly planted on the ground for years and years and years. But I think that if we can just encourage that identification of what those might be, I think that really helps us to fuel that authentic way of how we do this work.
Yeah, when you say authenticity, I connect a lot with that. And the work I do around imposter syndrome is all about that. It's like, how can we show up as authentic designers if we still have our own like trauma? And it's what I'm like going through with the imposter syndrome. Is like, why are we acting this way if we don't have our own willingness to be to let go of some part of ourselves and to like really listen. The empathy, I think, cannot happen if we're not authentic ourselves. So I think this is we have to do our own self-work to show up in the best way for the work we have to do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a really good way to put it. I feel like there's a sense of accountability for doing that inner work before you can show up as kind of the best version of yourself as a designer or of doing design. Thank you for that. So we have some specific questions for you, but I will encourage anyone else to jump in if you feel called about that topic. For Max, a question came up with the kind of continuing with this idea of what happens within us. How imposter syndrome usually comes from within. How do you recommend we handle silencing others feeding that belief and convincing that we're not good enough? So how do you challenge your own beliefs about imposter syndrome within systems and environments that may not necessarily be conducive to that?
Yeah, and by system, I also see like oppressive systems that are like keeping us down, right? And I'm part of a marginalized community by being trans and part of the LGBTQ community. And I see that there's a lot of way that we are not encouraged to achieve things. And we have to fight for our own rights, which is already very low in terms of like, how can you be thriving if you're already fighting for your own basic human rights? So I think there's a point where the more you work around your own inner power, there's a point that you can really trust when someone is telling you that you don't do enough, you don't do good enough, that you trust yourself that, no, I did. I know because I did that in the past. And then I'm like, I know I show up for myself because, and it takes a lot of time. For me, it took like many years to really have this feeling of, I really own my own success. I know what I'm doing. And it also breaks relationships. There's some people you cannot work with, and that's fine. But like owning our nose and to really like, be aligned with who we are and be aligned with the people we work with is, for me, like, that's my goal. That's my goal, is to find that balance all the time.
Yeah.
Rachel, did you want to say something about imposter syndrome? No? Okay, so I just find it really interesting that you both seem to define very, very naturally, very obviously, imposter syndrome as being not good enough. Because I experience imposter syndrome every day, but mostly my experience is not so much being not good enough, but not being the right person in the right place. I feel out of place all the time. And some of it is very good, some of it is I'm very comfortable with it. And I think my journey as a migrant and other personal stories, I think, have prepared me to not care that people some people feel that I shouldn't be here. But it also creates a very good space of them not knowing that you're not good enough, I guess, because you are working with people in other fields. And often I'm the only designer in the room, in the project. And so they don't know, if I'm not good at design, they don't know that I'm not good at design because they are not designers. So I think it's just, yeah, kind of getting away with things. But it's a lot of work. I here in Aotearoa, there are some things that are taboo, that are culturally bad, like forbidden. And I've done a few of those things and in the last 6 years. And it's almost on a daily basis. I kick myself like, I should have known that before I did it. But it's just a process, a journey, I think.
Yeah, I appreciate you sharing your own way of like not being in the right spot. I think it's part of it's still imposter syndrome. There's a lot of type of imposter syndrome, and I do believe that you are a good designer. There's no bad, like, yeah.
Yep. Let's see, other questions. This one is for Rachel. So the question asks, assuming I am currently in a design project, based on lots of research, what should be done to what should be done to account for trauma-informed? So it sounds like they're asking for some sort of like first step to ensure that they're bringing up the dialogue.
Yeah. Oh, there are many things that come to mind. So I think one that I will focus on, and I really tried to, when I was talking, I tried to integrate it as both trauma that may come up for us ourselves as part of design teams or just as individual designers, but also how to maybe look out for that in others. So either within the team or within other individuals that are part of that greater design research process. I would probably start by looking at some of the language that we use internally that we sometimes share with individuals before we interview them. So I would look for words like, what are some of those words or those prompts that we give ourselves that others may not necessarily see, that can maybe provoke or push us either intentionally or unintentionally to dig deeper on questions that we might not necessarily even need to ask, but we just want to ask because we're curious. I think a lot of designers are curious. So one of those words that in a lot of my own work and application of this that I've kind of honed in on has been the word probe. I've noticed in a lot of different design interview guides, design like scopes of projects, just even that use of that word probe, we might think that the intention is not to potentially cause harm, but the impact of using those words, and especially in the context of when we are in that flow of that exchange of rapport building and communicating with someone or having them do something that can really start to steer us in a direction that I think is, again, from my social work lens, is highly unethical, would maybe steer us towards being much more manipulative or just extractive in the design research process. I think another thing that I believe even the best, most ethical, most trauma-informed and trauma-responsive designers continue to struggle with are just around questions. Like, what are the questions that we absolutely need to ask that are going to get us to the end goal of what that scope of that project might be? Are there questions that we are asking that are really just encouraging people to divulge deeply intimate and personal things, often traumatic stories that can cause harm and trauma for us? I mean, the vicarious and secondary trauma is absolutely real, and it does have an impact on us, and it may not have an immediate impact on us. So I definitely encourage, look at, are there questions that you are even asking that are really irrelevant to the overarching goal? And then maybe this third thing that I'll add is do you have a timeline that has some flexibility built into it? Is there breathing room? When I've been a part of design interviews and design research, I very intentionally try not to schedule anything after certain types of interviews that I know might be either like just dysregulating for me personally, or so I don't have to like jump into another thing. I think these might seem very, very simple, but I have found in talking to designers from all over the world, they have a very hard time just making these adaptations to the current process, because we're just so used to the pattern of what we do. So I would encourage these small tweaks that are really going to have a significant impact.
Those are really excellent. Another question that was geared toward Max and imposter syndrome, but again, I think it kind of applies for all of these spaces, is this idea of getting a seat at the table. So in this context, the question asks, what would you suggest for those who are trying to get a seat at the table, but might make mistakes or might kind of have the process go imperfectly? Would that mean loss of opportunities, and how do you kind of handle the growing process while trying to get a seat at the table, while navigating your own internal sense of confidence and battling the imposter syndrome?
Yeah. I mean, the recommendation I made was like for leaders to welcome making mistakes and to role model. If you are in a situation, company culture where it's not allowed to make mistakes, that's not your fault. The company culture is having a way of not welcoming innovation, because you make innovation and growth when you make a mistake, when you take a risk. I don't know, for me, it's like, is it the right table you want to be a seat at? It's like, are you really, this is where you want to grow, or is there another more like healthier environment where mistakes are welcome, and then when you would like thrive and be more understood as a designer or as a researcher or whatever you are trying to accomplish. If you don't get a promotion or an opportunity because of a mistake you made, I think this is not a very healthy company culture. That's my thought. I don't know. I would love to hear from Rachel and Ricardo.
The seat at the table question is an interesting one, because I'm going to connect it to George, because it's a question that I remember posing to him. I believe it was one of the first times we spoke, and it was over the phone. And he asked me pointedly, he said, why, as a social worker, why do you want a seat at the design table? And he didn't say it in a condescending way or in a way that was in any way, shape, or form disrespectful. And I remember sort of like stammering over my words and kind of having why aren't we being invited? Maybe in some ways like feeling some of those sentiments, like what Max has talked about around imposter syndrome. But then he went on to say that he said the skills and the ability and the way that you approach your work as a social worker would take me decades to build those skills as a designer. He made this assertion that like we have to work together, and if there's a table to either be invited in or not, then maybe it's not a table after all. Maybe it's a different context or a different new discipline or new way of doing this altogether. So I liked how we just throughout that exchange and throughout the time that we've spoken a number of times since then, I like how I think about that often, because it makes me think about, okay, well, what kind of a role could I have as a social worker? Because for many years, I felt very much as an outsider, and I felt like an outsider even within the social work discipline, because I have a clinical license, but I study macro social work. So I study systems and policy and advocacy, most social workers around the world are very, very clinical. And I have that expertise. I can do that. I have done that, but I choose to do this in a different way, which I think is what makes me a bit of an anomaly, even in design, but even especially in social work as well. So maybe, I don't know, maybe the table isn't the thing, like I'd almost like to think like, maybe Max and Ricardo and I and you, Marina, maybe it's maybe it's a bubble instead, and we can coexist within this ecosystem in a way that is going to be like symbiotic and open and respectful and inviting to all.
Yeah, it's not a table. I imagine it as a trampoline. Somehow that sounds like a lot more fun. Ricardo, was there anything you wanted to add to that? I couldn't tell if you were about to say something.
I was going to say, what is a table and who designed the table and who built the table? Because at least from my perspective, my experience, one of the biggest lessons I've learned in recent years is an exercise in humility, is to step aside. I think from the design tradition that I come from, we are eager and we want to do things and we want action and we like that kind of like center stage. I'm a very introverted person, but when I'm designing and when I'm with people and it just comes up, like I want to do stuff. I was going to say something different, but I want to do stuff. And I think in the last few years, also because I work with very young people, 13, 14, 15-year-olds, and the gap is showing. The gap is definitely showing now, not only being a Mexican in New Zealand, an anomaly, but now much older, probably older than their parents now. So giving a space to other people, to younger people, and there is a nice tension as well of familiarity and unfamiliarity. I think sometimes that that outsider role sometimes works in our favor because we can bring more authenticity to asking questions because we don't know. I remember the first conversations I had in South Oakland about gangs, or in the Philippines with the haciendas, the sugarcane haciendas in the Philippines with students. Very, very remote context from my growing up in Mexico, but at the same time, very familiar. There is something in South Oakland, there is something in Bacolod in the Philippines that is very familiar to Mexico. So you can get away with a lot of things by genuinely asking questions and knowing where these responses are coming from. Because for the white middle class New Zealander, Aucklander, although they share the city, they live in the same city, but there is a huge cultural divide between them and South Oakland and the gangs, and we're seeing it now with the pandemic. But yes, I think the table is a great conversation.
Thank you all for that. I love the different perspectives. This could go on all day. This is such a brilliant conversation. So it is with a pained heart that I say we've got to wrap and move on to the next segment. But thank you all so much for this dialogue, and I encourage all of you to connect with these wonderful speakers and keep these conversations going. So thank you very much for your time and your thoughts.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rachel, Max, and
Thank
Marina.
you. Yes. Thank you all.
Nice meeting you all. Bye-bye.